just like to say to Ken, where you at, Ken? Thank you for your introduction. You're welcome this morning. You did a great job, even if you're old and you can't grow facial hair. So that's all right. We like to joke around with each other, and it's one of the reasons I like listening to Ken sometimes, because he just has a great sense of humor. Well, Mitch is not here this week. He's off with family for Thanksgiving. I hope that you have great plans for Thanksgiving as well, and that you're going to enjoy that time of eating lots of food and spending time with family and watching football or whatever you might do, and maybe the diet afterward. I don't know if that's what you'll have to do after all the food or not. We are not continuing in the series that Mitch was doing. I think he concluded that last week. We'll do something different today. And I've got something I wanted to share with you. It's a note from an 8-year-old girl. She had asked her parents about being baptized. She wanted to be baptized. Now, I don't know exactly what they studied together or how the study went or the discussions that they had. Obviously, they didn't talk about spelling, because baptism is not really, is not how it's spelled, but that's okay. But they asked her if she would write a note or a letter to God with regard to what she's thinking. And this is what she's thinking. I swear I will live the rest of my life in you, O great God. I will open my heart to you and praise you all of my days. I swear I will follow you and never give up on you. I will wash your feet with clean soap and wipe it with my hair. Now, as she wrote that and thought about that, what was going through her mind? I mean, it's obviously not an explanation of what baptism is. She's talking about commitment, isn't she? That's really what she's focused on. She's making a promise to God. I will live the rest of my life in you. I will open my heart to you and praise you all of my days. I will follow you and never give up on you. That's her focus. And that's a great place to start, isn't it? That is very much needed. And the reality is that in our culture, we struggle with commitment. And it seems like this 8-year-old gets it. You've heard the stats about marriages, how 50% or so end in divorce. And that's been the stats for quite some time. Now, some may be a little bit higher, some may be a little bit lower. But what's happening today is that people are choosing not to get married at all. It's easier just not to get married. Don't make the commitment, because it may fail anyway, and so it'll be easier to move on. And we struggle with commitment in lots of different ways, in lots of different areas, with relationships and friendships and with church. There's a lot of church shopping, right? We jump from one place to the next because we want to find a place that we like and that meets our needs. And it tends to be all about us, and the reason it's all about us is because we grow up being consumers. We are taught to be consumers. If a store or a product doesn't satisfy us, we move on to the next thing. Because what we want and what we've been told through the commercials is that you have it your way. You get what you want the way that you want it when you want it. And that has bled into our relationships with people and into our relationship with God. And if God doesn't do what we want him to do, if he doesn't answer our prayers the way that we want him to answer our prayers, then we may just quit believing, because it's not working for us. But God calls us to something greater than that, doesn't he? I mean, it's easy for us to do that because that's what we're used to. That's how we've been trained. But commitment means you stick through things even when it's difficult, even when it's hard. When marriages work, they work because people stick to it even on the hard days. And if our faith in God is going to last, it's going to be because we stick to it even on the difficult days, because there will be difficult days. So what does Jesus tell us is the most important thing? What's something that we all know? In Matthew 22, when he's asked what the greatest commandment it is, he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. He's basically saying you have to be all in with all that you are, all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind. That's what he tells us we need, the kind of love, a committed love to God. Not one that's just based on emotion, but one that is deep within us. That's really an attitude that sticks with us, even when times are difficult. And the interesting thing about this is the love that he tells us we need to have for God is the same love that God has for us. It's a love that's committed to us. A love that is willing to go to whatever extent is necessary to give us what we need to take care of us. In John 13, Jesus is about to eat the Passover meal with his disciples. It says, and just before the Passover feast, it was just before the Passover feast, Jesus knew the time had come for him to leave this world, to go to the Father, and having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. Now, some of your versions of the Bibles that you have may say his love to the end. Now, a lot of times what we do is we think of the fact that what he's doing right after this is he's washing the feet of the disciples. He's humbled himself like a lowly servant and washing their feet. And I think it is talking about that, but I think it's talking about more than that, because where he heads after that, every step he takes is right to the cross. And at the cross, that's where he's showing us the full extent of his love. Now, my question is, how did he remain true to that? Now, there may be a number of different reasons or a number of different things that helped him to remain true to us, to be fully committed in this process, in this act of sacrifice. But leading up to this point, he's had a lot of opposition. He's had a lot of issues, a lot of things that he knows that are pretty negative that may have said, Jesus, don't do it. Let me give you some examples. The Jews were constantly questioning him. Now, these were not questions like, hey, I would like to find out some information or find out more about you, Jesus. These were questions to trap him, to trick him. They wanted him to fail. And so they were out to get him. But not only that, there were lots of threats against his life. There were people who wanted him dead. They wanted him out of the picture. And there were times that they tried to make these plans in order to get rid of Jesus. In addition to that, they tried to demonize him. Whenever he casted out demons, they would say that he was doing this by the prince of demons. And so they were muddying the waters for people. They didn't want people to see Jesus as good. They wanted to see him as evil. His family thought he was crazy. I mean, there was a time when Jesus was in this house and all these people had crowded around and he was speaking to them, and his family went to get him because they thought he was out of his mind. And so there were these, not issues just outside of his family, but also within his family that were actually crying out to him, just stop what you're doing. Don't go any farther. He knew that Judas would betray him, one of his apostles. He knew that one of the closest people to him would betray him, but he also knew that Peter would deny him. And so these are men that he had chosen who were actually going to turn their backs on him. And then he actually knew that all of them would fall away from him. He knew that when the going got tough, that they would all run. And so Jesus has all of these things happening, all of these things he knows that are basically crying out to him, don't do it. And he knew he would be crucified. And the thing about that is he'd seen people crucified before. He lived in a culture where it was a common practice. And people would know, they would see people who were dying on a cross. And they could see the suffering that was taking place. So my question is, how could Jesus remain true to us and true to the commitment that he made to us and show his love to the fullest, to the full extent? Well, in this passage in John 13, I think it gives us some clues. There are some other things that Jesus knew that really hold priority over the other things he knew. It says he knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God, that he was returning to God, and so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, he wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. And what Jesus knew is he knew that God is the one who had the power. He knew his Father had the power, and his Father had given him that power. He knew that he had come from God. He knew that he was returning to God. So he knew where he came from. He knew where he was returning. And then what he did was he got up and he began to serve, because that's really what his purpose was. His purpose was to serve. Well, if he knows who has the power, doesn't that give confidence? I mean, if you know who has the power and the power is with you, doesn't that give you confidence? And the reality for us is that we have that same power. We have the same power. Romans 8 tells us that God's Spirit lives within those who are Christ followers. In Colossians chapters 1 and 2, it talks about Christ being in you. It's a great mystery. That if the one who has the power to raise from the dead is within us, that means that we have that same power and should have that same confidence. Jesus knew who he was. He knew he had come from the Father. In Matthew 3, when Jesus is baptized, God cries out that this is his Son who he loves and that he's pleased with him. And so whenever we make that decision to be baptized into Christ, that same thing is known. And while we may not hear the voice, I wonder if in heaven the same thing is said. That this is my child, and I'm pleased with him or her. We were created in the image of God to be his children. And so, not only do we have confidence, but there's identity that we have as well. We need to know who we are, because a lot of people are really struggling to figure out who in the world they are. They don't know where they're going in life. Many people are trying to find themselves, right? I mean, we've heard that phrase before. But we know who we are in Christ. We're God's kids. We're sons and daughters of a king. Jesus knew where he was headed. He knew that he was heading to the Father. And he tells us the same thing in John 14, when he says, in my Father's house there are many rooms, and I'm going there to prepare a place for you so you can come and be with me. You see, we have direction as well. We know where we're headed. That this life, what we see here, isn't all that's written. That there's more. And it's a place where you and I belong because we are the children of God. And we also have purpose. Jesus' purpose was to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. And our purpose is to imitate him. We have been given the responsibility to be ambassadors for Christ. We have been given the responsibility to be ministers of reconciliation. What Jesus has done for us through the cross has reconciled us to God. And we are supposed to follow in his steps. And so we know who has the power, and that power was within us. We know who we are, we know where we're headed, and we know what we're about. And that should give us the ability, or at least the knowledge, to help us to go forward and do what God wants us to do, and really show him the full extent of our love as we remember these things. It should give us confidence. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. This may not seem like it makes sense at first, but you'll get it, okay? There's a story in Luke 7. And in Luke 7, it's a story of Jesus going to a Pharisee's house, Simon. He's been invited over to this Pharisee's house to eat dinner. So it says that they recline at the table. Now, these tables were low to the ground. And so, since they were low to the ground, they might sit on a pillow on the floor, or they may lean back. And so it seems like Jesus is reclining, apparently on his elbow, and his feet are sticking out away from the table because, you know, when you're walking around on the dusty roads and your sandals and your feet are dirty and smelly and stinky and all that stuff, you don't want them near the food, right? I don't know, maybe some of you guys put your feet on the table when you eat, I don't know. But most people don't do that. Okay, so Jesus is there reclining at the table. There's likely a number of men in this room, and it may be that it's all men that are eating. I don't know. But this Pharisee has invited Jesus to come and eat with him. And I do think that the Pharisee, and while the scripture doesn't say this, I think this Pharisee was really interested and wanted to find out a little bit more about Jesus. I don't think he was trying to trick him necessarily. But as they're there, there's a woman who comes into the room. And she's a woman who is not respected in the community. She's a woman who is known as a sinner. Now, we don't know what sins she's committed. All we know is that it's well known that she's sinful. And as she walks into the room, she stands over Jesus and she begins to weep. And she weeps so much that her tears begin to fall onto his feet, and they wet his feet. And she kneels down and she begins to dry his feet off with her hair. And she kisses his feet. And then she has this little jar of perfume, and she puts this perfume on his feet to anoint him. Now, the people in the room are watching this, and we know what Simon is thinking, because Simon's thought is, if this man were a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman she was, that she's a sinner. And the implication there is he would not allow her to touch him. How can he do this? And so what happens is Jesus realizes what Simon is thinking, so he responds to him. He says, Simon, I have something to tell you. 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and another 50. Now, a denarii was a day's wage, so 500 days' wages, as opposed to 50 days' wages. He said neither of them had the money to pay him back, and so he canceled the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled. He said, you've judged correctly, Jesus said. So the one who has had the bigger debt canceled would obviously appreciate the moneylender the most, because there's more relief there. He feels that sense of gratitude and that relief. So Jesus goes on. He says, then he turned toward the woman. He said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came to your house. You did not give me any water for my feet. You know, a lot of times in the homes, they might have a basin of water so that they could wash their own feet, or if they had a servant, the servant may wash their feet as they come into the house to keep the house clean. But Simon didn't give Jesus this at all. He says, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but the woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. Now, a customary greeting would be to kiss someone on the cheek as they enter your home. That's something that's practiced in, I think, some European countries as well. But Simon didn't welcome him that way. But the woman humbled herself and kissed him on his feet. She was honoring him in doing that. He says, you did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much, but he who has been forgiven little loves little. Now the comparison here is between the woman and Simon, really, because Simon is the religious man. He's the Pharisee. And the woman is the great sinner. Now, I think, and the scripture doesn't say this, but this is what I think. I think that this woman and Jesus had met before. I think that they had met at some point, maybe earlier that day, maybe it was a day before, in some situation where she suddenly felt the forgiveness that he was offering. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I just get that impression. Because she comes into this room, she finds him. She goes into a place that's really dangerous for her to be, because she didn't know whether they would kick her out. She didn't know whether they would ridicule her. She didn't know whether they would abuse her. She didn't know what their reaction might be, because she knew that she wasn't welcome. But she was willing to go in to show Jesus how much she loved him. She was willing to humble herself in front of all these people and show Jesus her appreciation. And in reality, she was all in, right? I mean, she was loving Jesus with all she had, with her heart, soul, and mind. What a great example of that. For us to know that, you know what, there may be some times that we may be ridiculed. We may have to take a chance, and we may suffer abuse. It could be that somebody doesn't want us there. But what God calls us to do is to follow the example of this woman and to love him with all that we are, and to love the people that we come into contact with all that we are too. Love them as ourselves. The reality is that Jesus has shown us the full extent of his love when he went to the cross. That even in the face of all the opposition and all the ridicule that he received, in all of the ways that people wanted to get rid of him and kill him and abuse him, all the hate that they showed to him, he was still willing to go to the cross for each of us because he loved us completely. And so what about you? Where are you at this morning? How much do you love God? How much do you love Jesus, the one who died on the cross for you? Because what he wants is for us to show the love to him that he has shown to us. It may be that you've been struggling with that. It may be that you have been complacent. It may be that you have just been going through the motions. You may think that it's okay that you give God a couple hours on Sunday and give him a little bit of money, and then that's good. You're good with him. But if he gave us as much as he gave, shouldn't we give him so much more? How much do you love God? Are you struggling with that? Are you struggling with your own commitment to him? I know that we are not perfect people. We all make mistakes and we fail, and I struggle with going through the motions. I mean, I would think that most of us do it from time to time. If that's something you're struggling with now, or if you're ready to make that commitment or discover to find out what it means to make a commitment to God, what we want to do in here as a body of believers who are struggling ourselves is to help you, to pray with you, to encourage you. And if there's a way that we can do that this morning, the elders will be gathered around the outside of the aisles. Let us know, because we want to help you and bless you. Would you do that as we stand and sing this next song?
In vain.